All right, so today we're going deep into the world of therapy. And to do that, we're going to be looking at this book, and How Does That Make You Feel by Joshua Fletcher.
Okay.
Have you had a chance to look at this one yet?
I have. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's kind of a behind the scenes look at what it's like to actually be a therapist.
Right.
Like not just the theories and the techniques, but the actual lived experience of a therapist. And, they're human too, right?
Yeah, and that's what I think is so interesting about this book is that it kind of pulls back the curtain and lets you see that therapists are just as messed up as the rest of us.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that Fletcher's trying to do with this book is to kind of demystify therapy a little bit.
Yeah.
Take away some of the stigma and make it seem less scary for people who might be considering it.
Totally, because I think there is this kind of perception of therapists as being these sort of like wise gurus who have it all figured out.
Yeah, like they're on some higher level.
Exactly. And this book really challenges that.
And I think in a good way,
Yeah, absolutely.
because, it makes therapy seem more approachable and relatable.
Right. And so throughout this deep dive, we're going to be talking about all sorts of different things. Everything from the therapist's own personal struggles and anxieties
Mm,
to the different approaches to therapy,
yeah.
the challenges of navigating the therapeutic relationship,
Right.
and what we can all learn from these experiences about mental well-being in general.
So it's really about getting a broader understanding of therapy and how it works, and maybe even challenging some of our preconceived notions about it.
Exactly. So where do you think we should start with this?
Well, I think one of the most striking things right off the bat is how open Fletcher is about his own humanity.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he doesn't shy away from sharing his flaws and his moments of awkwardness or even his own anxieties.
Right. And he actually says this pretty explicitly, like early on in the book. He says, quote, therapists are as human as everybody else.
Yeah, it's a simple statement, but it's so important because I think a lot of people forget.
And then he goes on to share the story that is just so relatable and also kind of embarrassing.
Oh, yeah, tell me about it.
So he's just finished a session with a client and he really needs to use the bathroom.
Okay, I've been there.
But of course, both the cubicle and the urinal are occupied, so he ends up having to urinate in the sink.
Oh, my God.
I know, right? It's like this incredibly human moment that you wouldn't expect from a therapist.
And what makes it even funnier is the way he describes his internal monologue during this whole ordeal.
Oh, yeah, his like inner voices.
Yeah, he's got like biology who's just like, thank you, like finally
wrong.
relief.
Right.
And then there's the critic who's just like, oh my God, Dr. Patel thinks you're vile.
Yeah, like piling on the shame.
Exactly. And then compassion comes in and tries to soothe him with like, it's okay to make the best out of a bad situation.
Right. It's like this whole committee of thoughts and feelings just swirling around in his head.
Which I think is something we can all relate to, right?
Totally. Like we all have those inner voices that are constantly chattering away.
And it's so refreshing to see a therapist actually acknowledge that and share it with us.
And it doesn't stop there. Like he then goes on to describe walking back to his office feeling super awkward about the whole sink situation.
Oh, God. Yeah, I can imagine.
Even worrying about like little kids coming in and using the sink later.
It's just so human and vulnerable, you know?
It is, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the book.
Yeah, like he's not trying to present himself as this perfect therapist who has all the answers.
Right.
He's just a guy who's trying to do his best and help people, and who also happens to have a really embarrassing sink story.
And I think that's so important because it makes him seem more approachable and relatable.
Right, like he's not this untouchable figure on a pedestal.
Exactly. And that makes it easier to connect with him and with his insights about therapy,
So moving on from the sink incident,
which I think we can all agree was a highlight.
definitely a memorable moment.
Fletcher also shares a lot about his anxieties and insecurities, especially when it comes to meeting new clients.
Oh yeah, that's so relatable.
Like he talks about this new client named Daphne and how he's kind of freaking out before their first session.
In what way?
Like he's super self-conscious about how he looks. He's brushing his hair like a million times, checking his reflection in his phone.
Oh God, the phone reflection check. We've all been there.
I know, right? And he's even worried about whether Daphne will think he seems unprofessional.
Like, is my office tidy enough? Do I look the part?
Exactly. And it's so funny because it's just like the kind of things that we all worry about before a big meeting or a first date.
Totally. It's those universal anxieties that come with wanting to make a good impression.
And of course, all of his inner voices are back in full
Oh,
force.
I bet.
Like triggers there, anxiety's there, the critics having a field day.
Yeah, it's like his whole internal committee is having a meeting about Daphne.
Exactly. And it's so fascinating to see how he navigates all of these different thoughts and feelings.
Because it shows that even therapists have to deal with their own internal chaos.
Right, and that they have their own ways of coping with it.
And I think that's really reassuring for people who might be struggling with their own anxieties.
Yeah, because it shows that you're not alone and that even the experts have to work at it.
And then there's the whole issue of the no-show client.
Oh, yeah, Daphne.
Yeah. So she's late for their first appointment, and Fletcher's waiting and starting to get a little bit frustrated.
Right, and he's like going through all these different emotions.
Like, first he's worried, maybe something happened to her, maybe she's scared to come.
Yeah, he's trying to be empathetic,
Exactly. But then as the minutes tick by, he starts to feel a bit annoyed.
which is totally understandable.
Yeah, like he set aside this time for her,
Yeah.
and she's not respecting that.
And then his irreverent voice chimes in with a joke about how maybe she's just really bad at reading clocks.
Right, which is like his way of coping with the frustration.
And finally, Daphne arrives like 45 minutes late,
Oh, wow.
and all of his inner voices just explode with, oh dear.
Yeah, it's like his whole internal system just short-circuited for a second.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a really funny moment, but it also highlights how unpredictable and sometimes challenging therapy can be.
Especially when you're dealing with real people, with real lives,
Yeah.
and all the complexities that come with that.
And this whole experience with Daphne kind of sets the stage for Fletcher's discussion about the origins of anxiety.
Which is actually really insightful.
Okay, so tell me about that.
So he starts by explaining that anxiety is basically your body's way of responding to a threat.
Okay, the fight or flight response.
Yeah, exactly. But he points out that these threats aren't always like physical dangers.
Right, like a tiger chasing you.
Exactly. They can also be threats to your self-esteem or your social standing.
Oh, like worrying about a presentation at work.
Yeah, or being afraid of rejection or humiliation.
And he says that the anxious mind tends to focus on doubt, which just amplifies the feeling of threat.
Right, like it's constantly scanning for things that could go wrong and then latching onto them.
And then he brings in this really interesting evolutionary perspective.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
So he argues that this fear of judgment and rejection that we feel so strongly today is actually rooted in our evolutionary past.
Okay, how so?
Well, back when our ancestors were living in tribes, being rejected from the group could have meant death.
Right, because you wouldn't have anyone to protect you or share resources with.
Exactly. So behaviors that helped us belong, like being agreeable and following the rules, would have been really important for survival.
So it's like this ancient wiring that's still influencing how we react in social situations today.
And he connects this to our modern day anxieties, like feeling pressure to succeed at work or struggling to say no to people.
It's like our brains are still stuck in that tribal mindset, even though the threats we're facing are totally different.
And that can lead to a lot of unnecessary stress and anxiety.
Exactly. And I think understanding this evolutionary perspective can be really helpful for people who are struggling with these issues.
Because it can help you to reframe your anxieties and see them in a new light.
Right? Like maybe it's not that you're inherently flawed or weak. It's just that your brain is trying to protect you in a way that's no longer relevant.
And then Fletcher moves on to talk about the different approaches to therapy.
Yeah, and he does it in such a funny way.
Oh, yeah, like he starts off by making this joke about the difference between a psychotherapist and a counselor.
Oh, what did you say?
He says that the only real difference is that psychotherapist sounds way cooler and has more syllables, which is why he puts it all over his website.
I love that.
It's so self-deprecating.
Yeah, he's not taking himself too seriously.
And then he goes on to talk about all these different modalities of therapy, like psychodynamic, person-centered, CBT, transactional analysis, trauma-informed, and so on.
And he's not afraid to point out some of the less glamorous aspects of the therapy world.
Yeah, like what?
Well, he says that while therapists can be incredibly helpful, they can also be nauseatingly self-righteous and annoying.
Oh, that's fun.
And he even jokes about therapists having this mysterious staff room where they smoke cigars and scheme against our clients.
Which is obviously a joke, but it kind of highlights the fact that therapists are just people. Like they have their own quirks and personalities, and sometimes they can be a little bit pompous.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that because it can be easy to put therapists on a pedestal.
Yeah, and then Fletcher makes this really important point about how there's no one-size-fits-all approach to therapy.
Right. He says that no single modality is universally effective.
And that the most important thing is finding a therapist who you connect with and who uses an approach that resonates with you.
Exactly. It's like trying to find the right shoe. you know?
Yeah, you wouldn't just buy the first pair you see without trying them on.
And he uses this great analogy to illustrate this point.
What's that?
He says that saying therapy didn't work for me after just one try is like saying I tried sports and didn't like it
Yeah.
after only playing lawn bowling once.
That's so true.
Like you need to experiment and find what works for you.
And he also talks about how therapists can sometimes get really attached to their own specific training.
Oh yeah, he calls them modality purists.
Right, and he says that they can sometimes experience cognitive dissonance when their approach doesn't seem to be working for a client.
Which is basically that uncomfortable feeling you get when your beliefs clash with reality.
And gives these really funny little descriptions of different modalities, like the psychodynamic therapist who's always digging into your childhood.
Yeah, and the person-centered therapist who's just like, and how does that make you feel?
And the CBT therapist who's all about changing your thoughts and behaviors.
And the trauma-informed therapist who's always looking for the root of your problems in past experiences.
Right, and he even jokes about integrative therapists like himself who try to combine different approaches.
Yeah, he says they're the most self-important of them all.
But ultimately, he argues that the most important factor in therapy is the relationship between the therapist and the client.
Yeah, the connection and the trust that develops between them.
Exactly. And so he identifies as an integrative therapist, meaning he draws from different modalities depending on the needs of the client.
Right, and he specifically mentions being trained in humanistic counseling and CBT.
And he's open to learning more and incorporating new approaches as he goes.
Which I think is really important because the field of therapy is constantly evolving.
And a good therapist is always willing to grow and learn.
So how does all of this actually play out in practice?
Well, Fletcher shares a lot of really interesting examples of his work with different clients.
Okay, like who?
Well, there's Levi, who has some pretty unusual beliefs around demonic possession and engages in self-harm as a form of penance.
Oh, wow, that sounds intense.
It is, and it's a really challenging case for Fletcher because he has to try to understand Levi's perspective while also addressing his self-harming behavior.
And how does he navigate that?
Well, he talks about all the different thoughts and feelings that are going through his head.
Yeah, like his inner voices.
Exactly. So he's got the detective who's trying to piece together Levi's belief system and understand how he came to these conclusions.
Yeah.
And then there's the part of him that just wants to escape the discomfort of the situation.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tempting.
Right. But then compassion kicks in and reminds him to stay present and keep trying to connect with Levi.
So it's like he's constantly having to manage his own reactions and stay focused on the client's needs.
And there's this really interesting moment where Levi comments on the buffalo sculpture that Fletcher has in his office.
What does he say?
He says it's all pretense.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like he's accusing Fletcher of putting on a show of being this wise therapist when really he's just as messed up as everyone else.
Which kind of goes back to that idea of therapists being human.
Right, exactly. And it's a good reminder that clients bring their own perspectives and baggage into therapy.
And that those perspectives can sometimes clash with the therapists.
And then there's Zara, who struggles with panic attacks and those classic what-if thoughts.
Oh, yeah. Those can be really debilitating.
They are. And so Fletcher takes a very gentle and reassuring approach with Zara.
Okay, like what does he do?
Well, he starts by acknowledging her anxiety and validating her feelings. And then he asks her some questions about her past experiences with these thoughts.
Like trying to understand the triggers and patterns.
Exactly. And he does it in a way that's very calm and non-judgmental.
So it's like he's creating a safe space for her to explore these difficult emotions.
And one thing that comes up with Zara is her reluctance to burden her mother with her problems.
Oh, yeah, that's so common.
It is, and it really speaks to that fear of judgment and rejection that we were talking about earlier.
Right, like she doesn't want to worry her mother or make her think less of her.
And so Fletcher helps Zara to understand that it's okay to ask for support and that her mother probably wants to help.
Which is an important message for anyone who's struggling with something.
Yeah, like you don't have to go through it alone.
And then Fletcher introduces this really interesting concept called introjections.
Oh yeah, what are those?
So basically, they're beliefs and attitudes from other people that we've internalized and made our own.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow.
So like think about all the messages you received growing up from your parents, your teachers, your peers, society in general.
Right.
And some of those messages might have been really helpful, like look both ways before you cross the street.
Yeah, good advice.
But others might have been more harmful, like you're not good enough or you'll never amount to anything.
And those messages can really stick with you.
Exactly. And they can end up shaping how you see yourself and the world around you.
Oh, so interjections are basically like these unconscious beliefs that we've absorbed from other people.
Yeah, and they can be about all sorts of things, from our body image to our gender identity to our religious beliefs.
And he gives this really powerful example of a child who experiences parental abandonment
Right.
and how that child might internalize the belief that they're unlovable or unworthy.
Which can then lead to all sorts of problems in their adult relationships.
And so Fletcher argues that becoming aware of these interjections is a crucial part of therapy.
Because once you identify them,
Yeah.
you can start to challenge them and replace them with more helpful beliefs.
Right. And he actually quotes Carl Jung, who said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate."
Which is such a powerful quote.
It is, because it's basically saying that if we're not aware of our own unconscious beliefs, then we're just going to keep repeating the same patterns over and over again.
And we're going to think that it's just our destiny when really it's just our interjections running the show.
And then there's this really interesting moment with Zara where Fletcher's intuition tells him that she's about to have a panic attack.
Oh, wow. So he like senses it before it even happens?
Yeah, and he decides to meet her outside instead of in his office.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it turns out that she was indeed feeling really anxious and was about to have a panic attack.
So his intuition was right.
And it's a really powerful example of how therapists aren't just following a script.
Right. They're also using their intuition and their empathy to guide their interactions with clients.
And then they move on to discuss exposure therapy as a way to help Zara with her fear of elevators.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, basically, it involves gradually exposing yourself to the thing that you're afraid of in a safe and controlled environment.
Okay, so in Zara's case, she would start by maybe just standing near an elevator.
Right. And then maybe pressing the button, and then maybe stepping inside for a few seconds, and then gradually working her way up to taking a full ride.
And the idea is that by repeatedly exposing yourself to the feared stimulus, you can learn that it's not actually dangerous.
Exactly. And Fletcher explains this by talking about the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for the fight or flight response.
Okay.
And he says that the amygdala is like the fastest but also the dumbest part of our brains,
Meaning what?
meaning that it can trigger a fear response even in situations that aren't actually dangerous.
Like if you see a snake in the grass, your amygdala might fire off a fear response, even if it's just a harmless garter snake.
Exactly. And so the goal of exposure therapy is to basically retrain your amygdala.
Like to teach it that elevators aren't actually a threat.
And he also uses this great analogy of a stress jug to explain how anxiety can build up over time.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
So he says that every day we're faced with all sorts of stressors.
Right, like work deadlines, traffic jams, arguments with our partners.
Exactly. And all of these stressors add up and fill up our stress jug.
Okay.
And if we don't have healthy ways of emptying that jug, then it can eventually overflow.
And that's when we start to experience anxiety and other mental health problems.
And what's interesting is that Zara realizes that her anxiety has actually become a trigger for even more anxiety.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, like she's so worried about having a panic attack that it actually makes her more likely to have one.
Which is why exposure therapy can be so helpful, because it can help to break that cycle.
And then Fletcher talks about social anxiety, which is something that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, me too.
And he says that it often stems from that fear of judgment and rejection that we were talking about earlier.
Right, and it can lead to all sorts of behaviors like avoiding social situations or overthinking every interaction.
And he says that one of the hallmarks of social anxiety is a hyperfocus on the self.
Like you're constantly worrying about how you're coming across to other people.
Exactly. And that can make it really hard to relax and enjoy social situations.
And then we meet Noah, who's struggling with a fear of becoming like his father.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so his father has a history of anger issues, and Noah's really afraid of inheriting that same tendency.
That's a heavy burden to carry.
It is. And so Fletcher helps Noah to explore those fears and to develop healthier ways of coping with anger.
And he introduces this concept of the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response.
Okay, remind me what that is.
So basically, it's your body's automatic response to a perceived threat.
Okay, like the fight or flight response.
Yeah, but it's more nuanced than that.
Okay, how
So
can I...
fight is obviously when you confront the threat head on.
Right.
Flight is when you run away from the threat.
Okay.
Freeze is when you basically shut down and play dead. And what's fawn?
So fawn is basically when you try to appease the threat by being overly agreeable or people-pleasing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it's often a response to trauma or abuse.
Like if you grew up in an environment where it wasn't safe to assert yourself.
Exactly, and so you learn to cope by trying to keep everyone happy.
And so Fletcher helps Noah to understand that His fear of becoming like his father is actually a sign that he's different from his father.
Because he's aware of the problem and he's actively trying to change it.
Right, and that's a really hopeful message.
It is. And then there's Daphne, who's dealing with the effects of conditional love.
Okay, meaning what?
So basically, she grew up feeling like her mother's love was dependent on her achievements and her ability to please her.
Oh, so like her mother's love wasn't unconditional.
Exactly. And that can be really damaging for a child's self-esteem.
Because it teaches you that you're only worthy of love if you meet certain conditions.
And so Daphne has developed a lot of anxiety around trying to be perfect and live up to her mother's expectations.
And Fletcher helps her to understand that she deserves to be loved for who she is, not for what she does.
Which is another really important message.
And one of the things that I found really interesting about Fletcher's approach is his emphasis on empathy.
Yeah, he talks a lot about the importance of being able to see things from the client's perspective.
And he actually admits that this didn't come naturally to him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he says that he had to consciously develop his empathy skills.
Which is kind of reassuring because it shows that empathy is something that can be learned.
Exactly. Like it's not something you're either born with or you're not.
And he introduces this idea of an emotional conservatism scale.
Okay, what's that?
So basically, it's a way of measuring how open or closed off people are to expressing their emotions.
Okay.
And he says that the goal of therapy is to help people find a healthy middle ground on this scale.
So not being overly emotional all the time, but also not being afraid to express your feelings when it's appropriate.
Exactly. And he says that this is especially important in relationships.
Because if you're not able to communicate your feelings effectively, then it can lead to all sorts of problems.
Right, like resentment and misunderstandings.
And then we revisit Levi, who's received a diagnosis of OCD from a doctor outside of his community.
Okay.
But he's also deeply connected to a spiritual healer within his church and is undergoing various alternative treatments.
Oh, wow. So he's kind of integrating different approaches to healing.
Exactly. And Fletcher's really respectful of that.
Yeah, like he doesn't try to force his own beliefs on Levi,
And he emphasizes the importance of self-care.
which is taking care of your physical, mental, and emotional well-being.
And he says that self-care can look different for everyone.
Right, like there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And he also talks about the importance of listening to your body and your intuition.
Like paying attention to the signs that you're getting stressed or overwhelmed.
Exactly. And then there's this really dramatic moment where Fletcher is doing a driving exposure exercise with Zara.
Oh yeah, what happens?
So they're driving along, and this guy cuts them off and starts yelling at them.
Oh God, road rage.
Yeah, and it triggers a really strong emotional reaction in Fletcher.
Oh wow.
Yeah, he starts to dissociate, which is basically when you feel disconnected from your body and your surroundings.
Okay.
And it turns out that this reaction is connected to a past trauma that he hasn't really processed yet.
Oh, that's heavy.
It is. And it's a really powerful example of how therapists are just as vulnerable to trauma as anyone else.
And that they have their own baggage that they're carrying around.
And then we see this really tender moment between Fletcher and his brother Harry.
Okay, what happens?
So Harry's having some stomach problems and he's feeling really anxious about school.
Oh, that's so sweet.
And Fletcher's just so caring and supportive.
Like a good big brother.
Exactly. And it's a really nice contrast to some of the more intense clinical interactions that we've seen.
Yeah, it shows that Fletcher's empathy extends beyond the therapy room.
And then there's this really insightful conversation between Fletcher and Noah about depression.
Okay, what do they talk about?
Well, Fletcher uses this great analogy of shit-tinted glasses to explain how depression can distort your perception.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Like when you're depressed, everything just seems negative and hopeless.
And it can be hard to see any way out.
Exactly. And so Fletcher helps Noah to understand that his thoughts and feelings aren't necessarily reality.
Like they're just a product of his depression.
And he encourages Noah to start challenging those negative thoughts and to focus on the positive aspects of his life.
Which can be really hard to do when you're depressed, but it's so important.
And then Noah reveals something really disturbing.
What's that?
He hints at not feeling like he deserves to live.
Oh, wow, that's serious.
It is, and Fletcher's really concerned, so he calls Noah's doctor.
Which is the right thing to do.
Yeah, because he has a duty of care to his clients.
And it turns out that Noah has attempted suicide.
Yeah, and Fletcher goes to visit him in the hospital.
Oh, wow.
And Noah finally reveals what's been going on.
What is it?
He was drugged with GHB and sexually assaulted.
Oh my God, that's horrific.
It is, and it's a really heavy moment in the book.
Yeah, and it really highlights the kind of trauma that some people are carrying around.
And the importance of having a safe space to talk about it.
And Fletcher's really struggling with how to handle this situation.
Yeah, because he wants to support Noah, but he also has a legal obligation to report the assault.
Right, because GHB is a date rape drug,
Exactly. And so he ends up reporting it to the authorities.
which is a really difficult decision, but ultimately the right one.
And then Fletcher talks about the importance of clients advocating for themselves in therapy.
Okay, what does he mean by that?
So he says that clients shouldn't be afraid to speak up if they're not happy with something.
Like if they don't feel like the therapist is listening to them or if they don't like the approach that's being used?
Exactly. And he says that therapists should welcome this kind of feedback.
Because it helps them to provide better care.
And then there's this situation where Daphne invites Fletcher to her play.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and he's really conflicted about it.
Because of the professional boundaries?
Exactly. Like, he doesn't want to cross any lines.
But he also wants to support Daphne.
And so he ends up going to the play, but he sits in the back, and he doesn't interact with her outside of the play itself.
So he's trying to maintain a professional distance.
And then Fletcher's brother Harry is diagnosed with cancer.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and it's a really devastating blow for Fletcher.
I can imagine.
And he's really open about his grief and his struggles to cope with this loss.
Which is so powerful because it shows that even therapists aren't immune to pain and suffering.
And it makes him seem even more human and relatable.
And then we see Levi again, and he's actually making a lot of progress with his OCD.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah, he's been doing his exposure and response prevention homework, and he's starting to see results.
So he's learning to manage his compulsion.
Exactly. And he even apologizes to Fletcher for some of his earlier behavior.
Oh, wow, that's a big step.
It is, and it shows that therapy can really help people to change.
And then there's this awkward moment where Fletcher runs into Zara at a speakeasy.
Oh, yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it's like that classic sitcom trope.
And he's really conflicted about whether to approach her or not.
Because of the professional boundaries.
Exactly. And he ends up deciding not to talk to her.
Which is probably the right call.
But it shows how challenging it can be to navigate those boundaries outside of the therapy room.
And then Zara shares a really heartbreaking story about her father's death.
Oh, yeah, what happened?
So it turns out that her father was killed by her brother.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's a really tragic story.
And it triggers a really strong emotional reaction in Fletcher.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he starts to have flashbacks to his own brother's illness.
So it's like her story is bringing up his own unresolved trauma.
Exactly, and he has to take a break from the session to compose himself.
Which is a really important reminder that therapists are human too.
And that they need to take care of their own mental health.
Yeah, and then Fletcher makes the really difficult decision to terminate therapy with Zara.
Oh, wow, why?
Because he's developed romantic feelings for her.
Oh, wow, that's a big deal.
It is, and it's a really ethical dilemma for him.
Yeah, because he knows that it would be inappropriate to pursue a relationship with a client.
Exactly. And so he ends their professional relationship, even though it's really painful for him.
And it shows how seriously he takes his ethical obligations.
And then we see Fletcher really struggling with the anniversary of his brother's death.
Yeah, he's engaging in some pretty self-destructive behavior.
Like what?
Well, he's drinking a lot, and he's isolating himself.
Which is understandable given the circumstances.
It is, but it's also concerning.
Yeah, because it shows that he's not coping very well.
And then in a surprising turn of events, it's Levi who gives him some good advice.
Really?
Yeah, he tells Fletcher that he needs to take care of himself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's like the student becoming the teacher.
And Fletcher really takes Levi's words to heart.
He does, and he starts to make some changes in his life.
Like what?
Well, he starts going to therapy himself.
Oh, that's good.
And he starts to focus on his own self-care.
So he's practicing what he preaches.
Exactly. And then we get to the end of the book, and Fletcher's reflecting on his journey as...